Well, welcome to our Faith Forum series. This is the last of our series, and we're lucky to have the very Reverend Nicolette Papanek with us, also known as Nick, and she came our way through Dean Kate. So we're very fortunate to have her talking about Frances Perkins, and just a couple of things from her bio that I think you'll enjoy knowing. She, as I said, she is commonly known as Nick. She prefers a mobile life, having moved many times as a child in her corporate career. Her vocation as a priest has always been interim ministry. And when asked why she didn't settle down as a permanent rector or dean somewhere, her reply has always been she is not interested in settling down. She's always looking for ways to settle up, as it seems
nice.
That is how Jesus lived.
Settle up. That's a great phrase.
So she lives, makes her home now in Lawrence, Kansas. And Linda, I had to read this for your sake. You two will be fast friends. Her other vocation is fiber art, and as a holdover from education in Canada, she still spells color, neighbor, favor properly, that is with O-U-R.
With a U, yeah.
Her besetting sin is also Canadian-British. She puts her periods after the quotation marks. So, without further ado, I introduce you to the very Reverend Nick.
You never know what's going to connect you to people. Most people just think I'm crazy when they see how I spell things or how I punctuate, but it's hard to get a habit broken when you've had it din into you by a group of very loving nuns at St. School for Girls, Toronto, which no longer exists. There's an ugly rumor going around that I closed the school down, and that is not true. Well, thank you very much. I mean, honored to be invited to be a part of the series about our saints. And I have any number of favorite saints, but Frances Perkins is right up there at the top of the list. So I would like to begin with our collect for Frances Perkins, because I think it says a lot about both her and the way the Episcopal Church looks at our role in society and in public affairs. Let us pray. Loving God, we bless your name for Frances Perkins, who in faithfulness to her baptism sought to build a society in which all may live in health and decency. Help us, following her example and in union with her prayers, to contend tirelessly for justice and for the protection of all, that we may be faithful followers of Jesus Christ, who with you and the Holy Spirit lives and reigns, one God, forever and ever. Amen. Well, I have two openers for you to ponder as we talk about Frances Perkins, and it's these two questions. In what ways has your life with Jesus helped you integrate your life and your work with your faith? So in what ways has Jesus helped you integrate your life and your work with your faith? And the second thing is, what is it you most love to do? And how can you imagine doing what you love to do to help others? We can listen to the wisdom of Frances Perkins as she dealt with faith and action, and place her as an example for our own faith and action. She was deeply engaged in times as troubled as our own. She is really a shining beacon to light our way during our own troubled times. She went through depressions, she went through violence, she went through all kinds of the same experiences that we are having today, probably without a pandemic, but that's about it. She was deeply engaged in her times. There are some books that you might wish to explore if you're interested in reading more about Frances. And I'll give that list to Owen, but the first two books that I'll mention are my favorites. They're ones I've read and I tend to reread things. And the third favorite I have is a children's book, because I find wisdom in children, and people who write children's books have usually not grown up enough to destroy that early wisdom. So the first book for adults is called The Courage to Meddle, The Belief of Frances Perkins. And the author is Tom Levitt, and it's available on Kindle. The second is Tread the City Streets Again. Frances Perkins shares her theology. And the author of that is Dawn Mitchell, Dawn with two N's. And that's available both in print and in Kindle. The children's picture book has beautifully crafted illustrations. And the title of that one is Steadfast, Frances Perkins, Champion of Workers' Rights. And the author is Jennifer J. Merz, M-E-R-Z. See, there I go. M-E-R-Z, and it's hardcover. And I think it should come with a warning label. It's a children's picture book and a great gift for a little girl who thinks that she can't do things, or for a little boy who thinks boys are the only ones who can do certain things. This was also the winner of the Children's Choice Award, and I just ordered one for a 10-year-old friend. I know she'll love it. It's supposed to be to children up to 8 years old, but that's all nonsense. If I, as an adult, read children's books, then surely they'll appeal to somebody who's only 2 years older than the age limit. There are a whole series of other books. And the other thing that I highly recommend if you're interested is Amazon has a film about her. I watched it and it is excellent. It has lots of footage from the day, so black and white footage of things that were going on and so forth. And it really gives you a sense for the period of time that she lived through. And it's only an hour, but they pack an amazing amount of knowledge into that 1 hour. If you're, I'm not shilling for Amazon, but if you're an Amazon Prime member, I listen to it free. One of the great evils of our day, free listening. Frances Perkins was really President Roosevelt's conscience. She was the first woman on a president's cabinet and the first woman Secretary of Labor. She was the target of lies about her, resistance to her programs, and even death threats. My favorite quote from Frances Perkins was the one she made about President Franklin Roosevelt when asked how she managed him. She said, "The same techniques were just as effective with a 10-year-old boy." Now, in terms of Frances Perkins, one of the things that I personally find most interesting is that although her life was very difficult, and I'll talk a little bit more about that, but her faith intersected closely with what she loved to do. And that, I believe, is what God wants us to do, is to find what we love to do most and manifest that love to the world. And that is clearly what she did. She was passionate about justice, and that is what drove her life and her accomplishments. The undergirding for this was her faith in God and her sense that Christians and others of faith are called to manifest their faith in the world. She believed firmly that poor people were not poor because they wanted to be. She saw through the ways in which believing poor people wanted to be poor could absolve Christians of their responsibility to make Christ incarnate in the world. Now, she was born Fanny Coralie Perkins, that's right, Fanny, in Boston, Massachusetts in 1880, and she died in 1965 at the age of 85. Her roots were in the state of Maine. Her mother, Susan Bean, came from Bethel, and her father, Frederick Perkins, was born in and subsequently raised in Newcastle, Maine. Her father was both born and raised on land by the Damariscotta River that his ancestors had settled in the 1750s. The family farmed the land and also owned a brickyard. When the brickyard began to be less lucrative by Maine standards, which were somewhat basic, Frederick and his younger brother moved to Massachusetts. The eldest brother stayed in Newcastle to manage the farm. Then in 1882, Frederick moved his family from Boston to Worcester, or Worcester as it is pronounced in New England. Frederick then, go figure why it's pronounced that way, but that's how they do it. And I should know, since my mother was from New England. But Frederick then opened a paper goods business, and it successfully operates to this day, which is interesting. Frances's father maintained his ties to Newcastle, though. Fanny, as her family knew her, spent her childhood summers with her grandmother on the Newcastle farm. Frances was quoted as saying her grandmother was really the center of the family and an extremely wise woman, worldly wise as well as spiritually wise. Frances is also quoted as saying, "I am extraordinarily the product of my grandmother." Her grandmother's wisdom guided her throughout her life. And it's in this love of her grandmother that I first connected with Frances Perkins, the saint. My journey with her has been one of love. It is a personal story in its way that I think tells a lot about the function of saints in our lives. I trust that you'll enjoy and understand sort of my highly personal view of this saint, in addition to the facts about her. But she was a champion of justice, and even as a small child in Canada, in school, I could smell out injustice more quickly than anybody else. My first protest was a passionate, "Why can't I write with both hands? Why do I have to choose?" My second protest was about a month or two later, and I think it was to my parents. "When I grow up, I will never interrupt a child unless she or he is doing something dangerous. Why should grown-ups be the only people that get to do the interrupting?" How wonderful that later in my life, I found a saint that was willing to interrupt when something dangerous or unfair was happening. And Frances was a saint who was able to encompass home and motherhood, as well as a stunning vocation in governance. Frances' parents were Congregationalists, as were my New England forebears, but she decided to become an Episcopalian. When she was confirmed in Chicago, she took a confirmation name, and that's how she dropped Fanny and became Frances. And really, who could blame her for dropping Fanny? Frances is one of our women saints who is not a tortured martyr or a first witness of the resurrection or a nun or a virgin or any of the other stereotypes from which Christian women suffer. Frances honed her leadership skills in college and in her early work as a social worker. She attended Mount Holyoke, and she was elected president of her class and subsequently permanent president of her class at graduation. So now let's sort of journey back in time to when Frances Perkins first came to work, and this was in Philadelphia. Frances was quite likely one of the first people in this country, along with the Quakers, to commit to end what we now call sexual trafficking. She was hired by the Quaker-led Philadelphia Research and Protective Association. The association was fighting for protection for new immigrants, young and female. One of the many things Frances did was pose as a potential victim. Frances's task, interestingly enough, was to recruit ethnically diverse women to intercept new arrivals at the railway station before their male compatriots could lure them with false utopian promises. Her group of women would warn the young women, many were really girls, of the scam and direct them toward proper, decent accommodations. Through this work, Frances identified pimps, brothel keepers, dishonest employment agencies, and drug dealers. These activities of Frances and her team of women were not universally applauded, as you might imagine. There was a great deal of money being made. And she was once challenged by a police officer who asked her if she really wanted to put decent people out of work through her actions. Her reply was this: if that's the right thing to do. Philadelphia City Hall finally legislated that all commercial lodging houses must be registered and inspected. And that was Frances's first triumph as a lobbyist. I shared that joy Frances had when I worked as a volunteer lobbyist for the American Cancer Society. We were working to pass the Missouri Clean Indoor Air Act to prohibit smoking in restaurants and other public places. I imagined how Frances must have felt when the New Deal made it into reality. That's sort of how I felt. When Frances moved to New York City, she took with her the rigorous education that she'd undergone, both in college and on the streets. She also took with her what you might call a true moral grounding based in her studies and deeply rooted in her Christian faith. New York was, in many ways, at the time, a place where three religions intersected, with all three religions sharing what the author of Tread the City Streets Again called a politics of generosity. In 1930, half of the population of New York City was Roman Catholic. Most of the rest were either Episcopalians or Jewish. In fact, New York was the first place to offer Jews citizenship from the 1770s. I fancy that you probably didn't learn this in social studies in school. You might have, but one thing I believe we need to remember about the saints of the church is that while they were engaged with contemporary affairs, rather than being focused on ideologies, They were focused on God. Frances Perkins was committed in turning, okay, there we go. Frances Perkins was committed to turning social programs that solely gave people a short-term lift into programs instead that gave them a safety net from poverty, illness, and the terror of another depression. She demonstrated a love of human nature, and that love was translated into the movement of the government to sustain both the people and the programs. Frances was committed to seeing that suffering was addressed in ways that continue today. We have her to thank for Social Security, the minimum wage laws, and the length of the workday. There's one other way in which Frances and I connect, and I think it may have helped me hold on to my passion for justice. For Frances, it was that she could not make a decent living in Philadelphia. Even as an executive secretary at the PRPA, which is what the Quaker organization was commonly called, she made $50 a month. So she took additional menial work wherever she could find it. Thus, she acquired real knowledge of how agencies and employers treated vulnerable people, especially women. She never told her family, nor did I tell mine when I found myself in similar circumstances. In her adult life, Frances was really the sole support of her family, consisting of her husband and daughter. Her husband was mentally ill and often hospitalized with what we would now probably diagnose as bipolar disorder. There's so much more to learn and celebrate about Frances Perkins, including that through her time in public service, she spent days in silent retreats, and that one of the things that propelled her more deeply into public service was her witnessing the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. My paternal grandmother's stories of working in a sweatshop, knitting and crocheting a dress a day, informed my own search for justice. Frances knew deeply what justice can be, and that it is what God wants from us. I think that in many ways, what Frances did, and continues to do in terms of the influence that she has had in this country, is embodied in the words of the final verse of the Women's Garment Workers Union. It's commonly called Bread and Roses. And the final verse of that song is, "Our lives shall not be sweated from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Bread and roses, bread and roses." Laura, I see you nodding. I don't have.
There.
There we go.
I don't know why, but in the last week, I have watched a documentary or watched something, and they focused on that song. I'm not remembering right this minute what that was, but yeah, I've never heard it before, and I heard it last week, and now I'm hearing it again this morning. So I'll make a note and look into it.
Well, some of us heard it the first time in the 1960s at the Big Sur Folk Festival in California, sung by Joan Baez.
Oh my, were you there?
Oh yeah.
Wow. Awesome.
Yeah. That's actually where I was a maid at the what was then Big Sur Hot Springs, but became the Esalen Institute, which is a sort of a mecca for people who are interested in psychiatry and psychology and therapy and whatnot. But
I love Big Sur. I've spent a little bit of time there, not a lot. Thank you.
yeah, you're welcome. And I just envision the rest of the time that we have together as an opportunity to talk about, how do we personally integrate our faith in our lives, say in our work or in the way we deal with people, or just all kinds of things like that. I think a discussion is more exciting than and hearing different viewpoints than just having somebody yap away at you as I have for however many minutes that was.
Nick, could you repeat the two questions?
I can. That's the one thing I should have given you as a, to put up. But in what ways has your life with Jesus helped you integrate your life and your work with your faith? That's number one. So how has Jesus made it possible for you to integrate your life and your work with your faith? And then the second one is, what is it you most love to do? And how can you imagine doing what you love to do to help others? And I'll just give you a short example. As a fiber artist, I do still make some traditional-ish quilts that go on people's beds. I'm sleeping under one at the moment of my own. The next habitat build that the church in Lawrence, Episcopal Church, is doing in cooperation with other people, if assuming that the woman whose home it will be likes it and likes the other things that I made for it as well, then she will have a new quilt to put on her new bed in her new house. Because I think we forget with Habitat, and again, this is a justice issue, we forget with Habitat, it's wonderful to provide people with a house, but what if they're sleeping on the floor? And there is an organization of women actually in Columbus, Ohio, I think it is, or it may be in Cleveland, where with Habitat, partnering with Habitat, these women saw that people were moving into Habitat homes with no furniture. They just didn't have any, and they didn't have the money to buy any. So they met with usually the woman of the household. It's often a woman-led family, and drew her out about what things she loves, what colors does she love, what kind of artwork does she love, and then went on shopping sprees to secondhand stores, to rehab places, to the Habitat store, and found furniture that could be rehabbed, or something could be done with it, or curtains could be hemmed up, or whatever it was, so that the person and her family walked in to a fully decorated and livable home. No child sleeps on a mattress there on the floor. They all have beds. That's the kind of thing that brings me to tears when I hear about it. Because that's where faith and works intersect. And these women all love to decorate. So they took their love and they made it into something that could serve God. And see, that's what Frances did. So what is it you love to do?
A few weeks ago in this forum, I made an observation about this great cloud of witnesses, that we're looking at them from our point of view after their lives and accomplishments have been accumulated. But as we get to hear about their earliest beginnings from our various speakers, there was really nothing remarkable about any of them in their early lives that would indicate that they would turn out to be such wonderful people or accomplish such wonderful things.
Yes.
And that thought occurred to me earlier in your talk when you first posed the question about, what is it about Jesus' ministry or my relationship with him that helps make it possible for me to live my life in him? And what I thought of is that in the Gospels, certainly we have examples of addressing mass crowds and feeding 5,000 and having audiences with Pontius Pilate. But for every one of those stories, there's also just the walking along the road, encountering somebody and having a meaningful conversation, or going into someone's home for a very simple meal. And it just helps to reinforce to me that I don't have to look for massive ways to contribute to people around me and to share Jesus' love. I just have to go walking down the road. I have to live my daily life with my eyes open to see what I might do for someone.
By the way, I listened to, I haven't listened to all of them, but I listened to the other people's presentations so I wouldn't feel like a complete idiot. And yours was fabulous. But I look at that sort of a metaphor. I guess I just sort of think in metaphors. We all do. But it's the street sweeper who finds the golden ring and hands it to the poor person so he can feed his family.
Can y'all hear me?
Yes, I can.
It's crazy. If I unmute, you can't hear me. But if I mute, you hear me.
There's no technology.
Right. Well, first of all, being a nurse, it's just ingrained in me to do for others. And I haven't worked in a hospital and made money as a nurse in so many years, I can't even tell you. But I nurse almost every day. Somebody in some way, people know they can call me to get information or discuss a situation, and I can guide them in the right direction. But more than that, I'm also a writer. I've written 2 books about my family. And in writing those books, an example is my mother. I was able to say the many things that she always did for others. One example was the child that didn't have an Easter dress. She went out, bought the material, made the dress for the child. She had a child in the neighborhood that had trouble with math. So she tutored the child in arithmetic. Back then it was called, not math. And so I came from an example of 2 women, my grandmother and my mother. I never knew the difference. I cannot remember a time when I didn't do for others, or maybe in some small way. But I'm like Michael, I meet people out and about, and if you show them your love, yesterday, I'll give you an example. I was picking up a flower for one of the grandchildren that we'll be seeing today. And the lady in front of me, she and I struck up a conversation, and we were both worried about our country. And I said, we can't survive this country until we love each other. And she totally agreed. She just looked at me, and you could tell how grateful she was. She was a Black woman. I don't care what color they are, or what denomination, or what their heritage is. You take people just like they are.
I think that the other thing that is helpful to think about is how can a group of people do that sort of thing? Because I gave one example, for instance, of something that's grown out of a habitat house. Another good example is as an interim, one of the parishes I served, their previous rector, before I got there, had realized that she was absolutely incapable of saying no to people who came for assistance. Everybody got a handout, and on some levels that's fine, but on other levels, when you keep running out of money in your discretionary fund because you have given it to people who have sort of scammed you, that's another thing entirely. So in self-defense, she was incredibly clever, I think. She found a retired social worker in the congregation who was still passionate about helping people out of poverty. And the social worker, the parish decided to pay her a small amount, but she came 2 half days a week and 1 whole day. And those times were posted outside the church that if you needed assistance, you could you could call and make an appointment or stop by and make an appointment. Not all people have cell phones. Many of them do, but not all of them. And what happened out of that was sort of became the slogan of their outreach, which was helping people out of poverty, one family at a time. Now that's doable. If you imagine it globally, how many people are starving around the world and how many people are, how many children go to bed hungry, you have to scale it down to something that you can do. It may grow in marvelous ways that we don't know anything about, but you have to scale it down. And so it's very hard to imagine, at least it is for me and it is for most folks, to imagine every child in the world going to bed with a full tummy. But it isn't hard to imagine the children on your block going to bed with a full tummy. So why not start with your block? And that's what you're doing. Is it Nina or Nina?
Nina.
Nina. I thought it might be. Okay. It's that's what you're doing by greeting everyone and talking to them and finding out what it is. And I suspect you love doing that, don't you?
So natural. I mean, it's just part of me. Love or not, I don't know.
Well, we don't do things
it.
that we love.
I don't think about it.
No.
But she said, reminded me of Crescio, if you've been, and what they teach you is bloom where you are.
Yeah.
And this last book, when I wrote about my mother, I said she always bloomed where she was. And I think that's what all of us, Michael's talking about it. You just bloom. You do what you can where you are with what you have.
Well, and if you look at the things that go on in Scripture, you'll see that Jesus allowed himself to be distracted. He allowed himself to help the person that was right in front of him, yelling about needing help. He didn't wait for an appointment necessarily, although in our world we often have to do that. But his response was to the person of the moment. And I think we forget that. We're a very scheduled society in the USA, more so than some other countries, I think. And so we wanted to be that way. And it's not always easy for it to be that way. I'm looking at the time. Okay. What else do you love to do and find yourself doing that? Is that Laura?
Well, I have for like 15 years or so have had this life goal to be a SHME, a subject matter expert. It's just a matter of what am I a subject matter expert in? I've been searching for that. And then once I find that, the second life goal is to give a TED Talk, but you have to have an idea worth sharing. And so I've been searching for these things so that I could, check those off before I, hit the road. And what I have found in Jacksonville at St. John's Cathedral, my title, I'm currently furloughed, but my title is community builder. And so my job is to meet people and have coffee with them and connect them to where they might fit within the church. It's amazing. It's the best thing ever. And I'm becoming an expert. So
At connecting people.
Yeah, they show up and then I plug them into whatever it is that makes them happy.
Yeah.
And, and I pretty much know everybody in the church, so I know who's doing what. And so I can say, this person is interested in this and blah, connecting the dots there. So, in fact, I was having a conversation with my nephew the other day. Everyone in my family knows I'm trying to figure out what I'm a subject matter expert in, and then I can do the TED Talk. It's a long-standing goal that has not been checked off. And so I was talking to him the other day and I'm like, I think I might be a subject matter expert in meeting people and connecting them into an organization.
Yes, and it's a huge skill that is needed. How many times have you personally gotten an invitation to participate in something and then said to yourself, nah, but you love to do it.
I love to do it.
You love to do it. So
the other day,
Good at it. She is good at it.
Oh, thank you. So we had a funeral yesterday at the church, and Patrick Kimball, his husband, died, and he's the head usher at the church. And I just adore him, and I have for months, but I've been trying to figure out why, what is it about this one person that's just adoring? And so I helped a little bit with the funeral. And as the night before, I was like, what is it about Patrick? And like 6 months ago or something, he reached out to me out of the clear blue sky. I mean, he didn't know me, I didn't know him. And he goes, I need an extra person to usher this morning. Could you do it? And I was like, sure, I'd be happy to. And I started crying yesterday when I was talking to him. I was like, I finally figured out what it is that I loved so much about you, is that you reached out to me and asked me to help. And I mean, I reach out to people all the time, but almost nobody ever reaches out to me. It's just, but it was such a sweet expression. I mean, it was before the pandemic even. And he had just, anyway, it solidified for me that value in being in asking people to help. And so as I was reflecting on what is it about Patrick that I'm so, and it occurred to me, it's like, it's all because one morning he reached out and said, I'm one usher short, could you help me this morning? It was lovely. So I told him that yesterday, and he was like, he said, well, I've been having my eye on you. I figured you were an easy mark and you would say yes. So,
now that sounds like, somebody who does that would say that sort of thing.
Yeah. So
Maybe
anyway,
like their own gift, but at the same time, yeah. And it's clear to me, just in listening to you talk, I do a lot of work in neuro-linguistic programming. So, so you're all being watched for your facial expressions and your body language and all those other things. But I saw your face light up when you started talking about that episode.
Oh,
in a way that it had not before. And I think that that's one of the ways in which we, and not everybody is observant in that way. That is also a different kind of gift. But that's, I think, how it's intended to be, so that people like you can tell that story to other people who then may open them up to really listening to the next person to whom they speak. And that will enable them to then invite that person themselves. I know of a parish in Oklahoma with a young couple who are both priests, and one of the things that they've done is train their whole congregation how to welcome. And each differently. But it's remarkable, and the place is growing like gangbusters. So,
Well, it's one thing to put in the newsletter, we're doing this, if you want to help, sign up here. It's a whole different experience if you're doing something and you reach out to one individual and say, I'm doing this, and your particular skill set would be handy in this one thing. Would you come help do this one thing? And
Yeah,
I'll point out one person who is very skilled at making palm crosses, and that would be our very own Linda Privatera, who jumped
Lots-
in, made a whole bunch.
What it made me think of too, Laura, is that again, because I didn't put this in my short bio, because I'm not a consultant. What I do is called holy meddling, I hope, in congregations, but other people call that consulting, so fine. But one of the things that I notice that people don't realize is that, without stereotyping, age groups have something to do with how people respond to a need for help. So, for instance, people over about 50, if you put something in the newspaper, in the newsletter for the church or the cathedral, some people who are in that age group are accustomed to responding. If it sounds like something they'd like to do, they will volunteer. If you're 20, that's not how you want to be asked. You want somebody to send you a text message that says, hey, I'm doing something really exciting and I bet you'd like it too. Meet me for coffee and let's talk. And a lot of the time, you don't even know why you're meeting. I have a lot of friends who are in their 20s. It's good for personal growth. Someday I believe I might be a tech expert by the time it's all obsolete.
You'll be you'll be a subject matter expert in reaching out to 20-somethings.
No, I don't think I'm a matter expert on anything really, but I do think that it's important to know your audience, and we all, except the extreme introverts among us, we all like to actually be asked personally rather than receive a letter or a phone call or whatever. Now, the pandemic makes that even harder, but you can sure try to meet somebody online and do it that way.
Building on something that Laura mentioned, but also Nina talked about, it also has to do with who is it that we're reaching to, or with Owen sitting there, I'm going to rephrase that. To whom are we reaching?
Yeah, we share that, don't we?
And I think about things like Owen and Bill were so kind, and it certainly wasn't this summer with the pandemic, but 1 or 2 summers ago had the youth group up in their mountain home. And so you can literally plan devotionals that are mountaintop experiences when you're up there, but instead, and Owen, I'm going to forget the name of the woman, and was it the Deep Creek area that you connected the youth work where they did some service projects?
Yeah,
and
Linda.
Worked with families and children who are very much not living in the mountaintop cabins.
Right.
And so, to whom are you reaching out? Nina, you referred to that. Who do you choose to say hello to? Who do you talk about? And it has stuck with me for years. One of our former headmasters at the school where I teach, in his August speech to us, charged the faculty with this idea that it is easy to tend to the flowers, we must also tend to the cactus.
Yeah.
That if we're going to fully embrace our mission as teachers, we have to reach the prickly people. I can think of no one better than Laura. And Laura, what I'm thinking of are the coffee hours where you have sat and conversed with dear sweet Candy, who's the sweetest woman in the world, but she smells badly. I mean, there's no way of getting around that. And you just, it's as if it doesn't exist. You just sit there and have that conversation with her and carry on. And it's quite impressive. And I think we have to sometimes be very intentional about to whom we are reaching out.
This is,
Michael,
yeah, go ahead.
do you know the background of Candy?
I do not.
She's been a street lady for years and watched her for many years because I was over the gardens at the cathedral. But she saw her son and her husband murdered.
Oh.
And I don't think she's ever been the same since. She would be well addressed for the situation, like if cold or heat or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And she wouldn't let any of us come near her. But I would wave to her, and she may or may not accept it. But I know that she's coming to the cathedral. So, and I understand her situation, and just have maybe some spray with you that smells better than her situation. It's her situation. I don't know that she'll ever get over it or come around again. But it's very sad. She'll sit over by the diocesan office and slap herself and yell and holler. And I think everybody in town that she's near understands her, because I know my son's office was 4 or 5 blocks from there and he knew about her. We just know who she is. And you're fortunate that she's let you get near her. Or Laura's fortunate that she's gotten near, because she won't generally.
I think we need to wrap this up, but it surely is fitting to be thinking about Candy. A lot of us at the cathedral love her. I don't know how else to say it, despite the fact that she does smell. And we've all had conversations with her. When she is rational, she's brilliant.
She was a banker.
Yeah. Right.
When this happened. And it's just sad. But like you say, you just have to love her where she is that day, because other days may be different.
Well, this is the last of our Faith Forum series on the Great Cloud of Witnesses for this series, but it's been so successful. We are continuing it in Epiphany with wise women and wise men, and in Easter with Easter people. It's just been a marvelous experience. Each one of our presenters has taken us to a new place of understanding of these saints in this great cloud of witnesses. And thank you, Nick, for being with us. Once again, the timeliness of these presentations. Look at what we're going into church to listen to for the gospel of Matthew 25, and the story of the sheep and the goats. And that is the connection with scripture that has informed all of my adult life. And so that's exactly what all of you have been talking about where we saw Jesus in the hungry and the sick and the child and the widow and the prisoner. So thank you all so much for being here. Nick, I look forward to more conversations.
Anytime.
All right. God's peace and happy Thanksgiving. Next week, we begin a series on the stained glass windows in the church, which will be led by Dr. Scott Brown, who's a professor of art history at the University of North Florida. So please join us for those. And God's peace. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. It's been a great series.
Thanks for being with us.